All right, what is going on, everyone? So what follows in this video is going to be a conversation between myself and Dr. Mike Israetel. Many longtime followers on this channel will be familiar with Mike, but in short, he is not only a very intelligent guy with a PhD in sports physiology. I think his main claim to fame is being the most hilarious guy who also happens to be really intelligent and well-versed when it comes to fitness. So I think that you guys are really going to find this to be a really entertaining conversation. And also, this whole interview will be available on my podcast. I do have a podcast with about 30 or so episodes backlogged on iTunes and Stitcher, and I'm going to be trying to do at least one interview every month. So the next one is going to be, I think, on the vegan diet, and I'm going to interview one of the main writers at Examine.com on that issue. As for this conversation, Mike and I mainly talk about training volume, so how much total work you're doing in the gym, and this conversation really focuses on more of the theoretical framework. So I really let Mike lay out his whole training volume methodology and the theoretical basis for his sort of concepts that he's developed over the years. And it was a really interesting conversation. He's actually updated a lot of things over the last couple years. We did speak, I think, a little over 2 years ago now as a part of a roundtable, but I felt like we were able to really dig into the details a little bit more in this discussion. And also, we disagree a little bit about a few things when it comes to training to failure and levels of effort, I think. So hopefully that'll make for a bit of engaging listening. If you guys want to hop around and you're listening here on YouTube, I'll have all of the timestamps linked in the description box below and then also in the comments if you're listening on mobile. But also, if you want to help me and support this sort of work, honestly, the best thing you can do is, if you do want to jump around, open up a new tab and kind of just let the podcast or the interview run through. There's nothing that hurts me more than people who might watch 2 minutes of an hour and a half long interview. That just kills and really buries the video in the YouTube algorithm. So if you could just maybe open another tab, watch it the whole way through, that would help me a lot if it's no cost to you. But of course, don't feel necessarily any pressure to do that. If you do enjoy the interview, give it a thumbs up. That'll help more people get to see it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you subscribe because, like I said, I'll be doing a bunch more of these interviews in the future. This is something I want to keep doing. So without further ado, I hope you guys enjoy this interview with Dr. Mike Israetel. So guys, I'm here with Dr. Mike Israetel, and we're here for a conversation mostly about training volume and hypertrophy. And Mike, it's been way too long, man. Thanks for coming back.
Likewise, thanks for having me, man. And always good to chat.
So I will have done some kind of intro for you in the pre-interview segment, but maybe just to give people some idea of what you're up to right now, what you might be working on.
Yeah, so I used to be a professor for a long time, but Renaissance Periodization, the company that I helped to start a couple of years back, has gotten so big that I have to do RP full-time. So I do RP full-time now, developing a variety of sort of digital products and writing books. And I'm actually 3/4 of the way through the Renaissance Diet 2.0 book, which is kind of the most comprehensive book on body composition and performance dieting that we've ever written. It's looking like a monster. It'll probably be like 400 pages or something eventually. Yeah, so I'm doing a lot of book writing, training for hypertrophy. I'm currently somewhere between 250 and 255 pounds, and I have veins in my abs, which is strange. Eating is my road to 255 is just proving really difficult because after 250, my body's like, nah, and the amount of food is just getting some kind of absurd. So it's tough. It's stupid to complain about eating too much because there's people out there contest dieting, but it is a thing.
Yeah, it is tough. It goes in both directions. Like any way you try to push your body to the brink of where it's comfortable, it's going to resist. So I can relate on both ends.
Totally. And unfortunately, that's actually where you make the best progress. So.
True. And yeah, we actually met for the first time at the Arnold Classic. How was the expo experience for you?
Well, you know, my expo experience is mostly of the line to go see you wrapped around our booth.
Oh, no.
So every now and again, someone from your line would recognize myself and be like, "Oh my God, Dr. Mike!" And I was like, "Oh yeah, so what are you doing?" They're like, "I'm Jeff Nippard's line," and I'm like, "That's great." I guess you were also across from the DJ booth.
Unfortunately, yes.
I mean, I don't understand how that is something that the people who promote the Arnold allow. So basically, to give folks listening context, there was a booth at the Arnold, several actually spread throughout the Arnold, with like club decibel music at all times, and a gentleman yelling on the microphone, because he's not speaking on, he's yelling on the microphone.
Yeah.
So it was awful, because Jeff and I had to talk to people over this guy, and people come in to meet us and chat, and it was just it was awful.
Yeah, it was. I felt like I had strep throat for about a week after it.
Oh my God. Yeah. And it was just, if it was only like pleasant music and the guy was saying not stupid stuff, but this guy was just saying like, it was just terrible. It was the most bro-y shit you've ever heard.
Yeah. They should have done an open mic and had you go up there.
Right. A little jazz tune. I would have thrown something down.
So Mike, what I was actually thinking we would do is split this up into 2 parts, if you're down for that. So in part 1, I'd kind of like to give you the chance to just lay out everything that you've been developing to do with training volume and hypertrophy. For anyone who might have watched our volume roundtable like 2 years ago, you did lay out, I think, some of the fundamentals there, but I'd like to give you the chance to sort of elaborate on that and update those concepts, because I know they've developed a lot in the last 2 years. And then in part 2, I'd like to focus a little bit more on maybe a specific case. So in my case right now, I'm actually trying to incorporate more powerlifting programming into my bodybuilding style training. So maybe we can do like a full deep dive on so-called power building in that second part. But I think just to kind of get everybody on the same page and get everybody up to date, I feel like it'd be good to just do a full synopsis of kind of everything you've been working on with regard to training volume in this first part. Does that sound good?
That sounds perfect.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So the volume roundtable, it's got a ton of views now, I think. Quite a popular video. That was mostly me against 3 other people. Not against. It was kind of me sort of trying to just advocate, at least devil's advocate, for the higher side of volume, because there had kind of been this maybe sort of unspoken agreement in the evidence-based community that doing on the lower side of things, something had been termed sort of minimum effective dose, was a good thing, and that anything north of that was somehow sort of like on the net balance definitely worse. And I was sort of based on the MRV, maximum recoverable volume concept. I was saying, well, there are some good things to gain on that northern end. Ironically, the reason myself and my colleague James Hoffman, when we were sports scientists, I guess we still are, but when we were actively working with teams at the collegiate level, we developed the MRV concept in order to actually advocate for the opposite, which is basically say, look, there is a maximum amount of volume that your athletes can recover from, Mr. and Mrs. Coach. Going over that is just simply not productive, and in the long term counterproductive and even dangerous. So we were trying to basically say that there was this kind of cup you can fill, and you can fill some of the cup with sport training, some with weight training, some with technique training. And then after you filled the cup, any more training wouldn't work, because, there's a lot of, we've all played sports and we've all heard these sort of tropes of, outwork your opponent 110%. I remember in wrestling, people be like, whoever you're going to be wrestling, you got to train harder. And I was always like, what if he's training too much? Should we just double time it and just really die? There's right. This doesn't make any sense. So, and the whole idea of 110% is pure just mathematical nonsense. So we basically, it was funny that I was arguing for the more side of the volume, even though that had come from the less side to kind of to coin the MRV concept. But since then, I've been able to take a more balanced approach and talk about a couple of concepts in intersection, 2 in particular that are very important: minimum effective volume and maximum recoverable volume. Minimum effective volume is the least volume you can do and still see results in whatever it is you're looking for results for. Now, obviously, strength training has some kind of minimum effective volume. Hypertrophy training has another minimum effective volume. Power training has another one, et cetera, et cetera. But they all have their minimum effective volumes per the individual and situation. And then on the other end is the maximum recoverable volume, where it doesn't pay to train any lower than minimum effective volume if you want to make gains, and above maximum recoverable volume, it doesn't pay to train any more than that. So what you're left with is this kind of delineation, this band, this range where all productive training lives, and that's between MEV, minimum effective volume, and MRV, maximum recoverable volume. And I think that by the overload principle, especially if we want to train for hypertrophy, we should probably go from easier to harder over time. And I think one of those kinds of things is going from the minimum effective volume, maybe at the beginning of a mesocycle, slowly, either by adding weight, repetitions, or sets. And I've been an advocate of adding all of those, particularly sets and weight. But you move from minimum effective volume incrementally to maximum recoverable volume, wherein you can, by definition, no longer move productively upwards. That's when you deload, maybe change some rep ranges, change some exercises, or just deload and start a similar program, go back to your new minimum effective volume, whatever that happens to be, and start crawling all the way back up. And that's where I think most, especially for hypertrophy, most productive training lies. So I think nowadays I'm not so much advocating blah blah MRV. I don't think I have to, because I think I actually kind of made my point with MRV, where I think my quintessential point in that debate was minimum effective volume means by definition you're getting minimum effect. Why would you want that? I mean, why don't you want optimal volume? And if we can't find that, maybe it's somewhere between MEV and MRV. And I think it is. It's actually a lot harder to pinpoint because it also changes too. So, but I think if we train between MEV and MRV, we're in a good spot. That's kind of what I've been advocating for. The last concept that I've developed, there's maximum adaptive volumes somewhere in between, but it's just kind of a nebulous concept. If you're going from MEV to MRV, you'll hit it anyway. But another concept that's very useful, and I think it's going to be coming in handy for something else you and I talk about later today, particularly emphasis, de-emphasis training, is something called maintenance volume. So it turns out in trained individuals, especially, the amount of volume it takes to maintain a certain fitness characteristics, like not lose your strength, is actually way lower than the minimum effective volume that is designed to make it better, right? So, and I'm sure you've talked on this before on your channel, is like, if you just want a vacation with friends for 2 or 3 weeks and you want to maintain your muscularity, man, you got to train like twice a week with a compound heavy basics and you're good to go. But in order for you, Jeff Nippard, to make improvements to your, your pro physique, it's going to take heaven and earth to see any kind of results that are big. So those two volumes are really far apart. And I think this idea that maintenance volumes are much lower, usually, especially for the advanced, than minimum effective volumes, or even that range between MEV and MRV, allows us a really neat tool when we want to prioritize something or de-emphasize something to really move volumes around so we can make more space for productive training by not thinking that we have to always train hard to keep our gains. It's like, if you want to continue to be able to ride a bicycle, you don't have to ride your bike for an hour every day. Matter of fact, the maintenance volume for riding a bicycle is pretty much zero, right? But, playing the piano or speaking a foreign language, those have very low maintenance volumes if you think about it. You speak, if you are a fluent Spanish speaker, but you don't live in a Spanish-speaking place, you speak Spanish to your fiance or to your mother-in-law for half an hour every week, and you're as fluent as you'll ever be. You don't need to be immersed. And that understanding that maintenance of characteristic can be accomplished with relative ease can give us a whole lot of flexibility and sort of ingenuity in our training that we can use to be productive in other ways.
Awesome. Yeah. You're always good with the analogies, man.
I try, man. I got Steve Hall over here making even better ones. This is an analogy competition. I'm losing, so I got to up my ante.
That's good. So, Mike, I would imagine there's probably a lot of people who haven't watched that. In case anyone hasn't, it is really good, and it serves as more of, like, I think, an introduction to maybe what we'll talk about here. But just to save people maybe some of the time, let's first talk about exactly what training volume is. I know it's like a fairly straightforward concept, but in terms of the application, it can be a little bit tangly, especially in terms of like how you're actually tracking that. So how about you just quickly lay out your definition of what training volume is, maybe why it's important or why we think it's important, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Sure, totally. So training volume is how much you scream when you're lifting, and that counts internal screaming that no one hears.
Right.
So
it's measured in decibels.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Not joules.
Or emotion units.
Yeah.
Volume is actually pretty easy to define. It's the amount of physical work you do, and that's measured by essentially force times distance. The best sort of measurement of that in the gym is how much weight you have on the bar or in a machine, and how long the range of motion is. Although the thing is that if you're comparing your volume to anyone other than yourself, that's relevant. If it's just between you and you, which is almost always what we use these concepts for, you can just obviate that whole range of motion thing because it's always the same, more or less. Like you're always going to squat to the same depth and come back up, which is actually one of the reasons why myself and folks like Eric Helms advocate for a consistent technique, is because it's really difficult to compare squats if you always do a different depth, right? But if you always do the same depth, you kind of know what you're getting. So it's the weight on the bar, the distance, which is usually we obviate, and then the number of total repetitions that you do in training. Now, the total repetitions thing can get a little wonky because one of the things we're really looking for volume is the amount of fatigue that it causes, because we want to see how much volume we can stuff into a program, because we know, it's a little bit skipping ahead, volume is a predictor and a causative factor for gains. In some sense, if it's volume composed mostly of very heavy lifting, it is what causes you to get stronger, but it especially causes you to get bigger, especially if it's lots of volume in the moderate rep range. But since we want to know how much volume to do, because volume is the good stuff, it's the measurement of work that makes us better, we don't know how much we can stuff into our ability to recover, which is generally, although it varies a little bit, is generally pretty stable characteristic. Like if you can do 20 sets of back regularly and recover, you probably can't do 30 sets of back and recover every time you try. It doesn't matter how much you slept that night or how good your eating is. You're just not going to be able to reach that. People have certain, just genetic variation, et cetera, but you're only going to be able to recover from so much. So because volume is really closely related to fatigue, we can do a little better than reps. And if you tend to do fewer reps, but you're going super heavy, reps become not such a great way to measure volume, because each rep is so much harder, right? That it's way more than the amount of force that's added, way more than the amount of weight to the bar. The fatigue goes up exponentially. But on the other hand, if the reps are really high, each rep isn't super fatiguing, and it ends up going in the other direction. So I think Greg Nuckols came up with this originally, but it's the number of hard sets that you do in training, because it sort of obviates for that extremes of rep range, is a pretty good way as a proxy measurement of volume to tell you to relate volume more closely to fatigue. So if you do sets of anywhere between something like 5 and 20 reps, I think if you do 6 sets or 10 sets of 6 reps, or if you do 10 sets of 15 reps, that's probably going to fatigue you in a similar degree. And that now we can compare number of sets from program to program, individual to individual, and especially within the individual over time, to give us a good metric of how much can you do to make yourself better, and how much is too much that'll make you so fatigued you can't recover and you can't make progress.
Gotcha. Yeah, I really like the tough sets metric, just because it kind of gets rid of all of those problems, like you said, with like higher and lower reps, and then also going between different machines and different ranges of motion and
Totally.
different planes of motion and all that kind of stuff. It sort of just flattens all that out.
For sure.
So if we're tracking sets, what counts as a set for you? Because we can do warm-up sets. We can do different types of sets. What are you tracking there?
So, I generally don't count warm-ups when I'm talking about minimum effective volume, maximum recoverable. Warm-up sets, it's actually interesting. They're usually so easy that they have been shown in the literature to sometimes decrease fatigue. So if you, let's say, have a program where you go Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and your fatigue starts to accumulate a whole lot, if you skip Wednesday altogether, your fatigue is going to fall a certain amount by the time you hit Friday. Let's say you're super fatigued on Monday. After Monday, you're like, I need a break. If you take Wednesday off completely, your fatigue falls a certain extent. If you go in and only do the warm-up sets for Wednesday, your fatigue actually falls more. Something to do with getting blood through the area, perhaps some neurological effects, hormonal effects. But in any case, your fatigue might actually fall even lower. So if we, some people are really dogmatic and they say, you got to count all your warm-ups. 2 questions for that. One, if they don't really add to fatigue, why are we counting them? If they essentially, on average, add nothing to fatigue, why are we counting them? And second of all, what the hell kind of warm-ups are you doing that the volume from them is so extensive? I mean, my guy, some people really do warm up wrong. There's like this idea that if you do sets of 10, you warm up by sets of 10 all the way from 135 to 405, and then you start doing sets of 10. I mean, that's insane. So I think that I definitely don't count warm-ups. I count straight sets. And then I always get this question. It gets really tricky to count drop sets and to count supersets At that point, you have to be, I think, even doing those kinds of things, you have to be more advanced to really benefit from them and to be able to execute them properly in a program. And by then, you kind of have a feel for how fatigued anything is making you, and you can set up a proxy for yourself. So, for example, a superset of leg presses to squats, you might just count as 2 sets because, damn, that it will mess you up. But a superset of biceps curls on a cable to upright rows, even, let's say like you're really using the upright rows to just finish off your biceps, and it's only like 3 to 5 reps of upright rows right after curls, and your biceps are done, you can't move anymore. You might actually just proxy count that as 1 set, because having experimented with it, expecting it to be like 1.5 sets worth of fatigue, it just never amounts to that much fatigue. So I think the rest of the stuff comes down to experimentation. The safe bet is just to count sets as they are. Like if it's a superset, just count it as 2 sets. But you'll learn that usually supersets are not as fatiguing as you would think. Maybe 1.5 sets is a good proxy. But that's so individually dependent. I just leave that up to the individual.
Right, yeah. It kind of reminds me of the people who will ask, like, should I, when I'm tracking my macros, should I weigh this cooked or should I weigh it raw? And it's kind of like, as long as you're consistent with it over time, it's okay. It's kind of 100%. The same thing here. It's like people will put these volume milestones or whatever you want to call them on a pedestal and say, like, I've got to hit 20 or whatever it is, but it's so individual and so relative that as long as you have some scale of directionality in terms of whether to move it up or move it down, the actual specific number is less important. I mean, I wouldn't just say that. I think you summed it up perfectly, and I would love for people to sort of listen to that again.
The volume landmarks are all come with instructions of how to detect them and how to redetect them. And because they also change, people say like my MRV is 22 sets for quads. It's like, yeah, this mesocycle it is. It might be 20 the next. It might be 18 after. It might be 24 after that. As long as you know what you're looking for and you have a range, then you're good. One of the, I think, the most valuable things about volume landmarks is learning over a period of about 6 months for every individual, getting a good target range for yourself for each of your main body parts. Here's where this comes in handy. For example, my range for hamstring MRV personally is like 10 to 15 sets per week is the most I can do for hamstrings, including both leg curls and hip hinges. And after that, I can't recover anymore. My side delt MRV is something like between the mid 20s and the high 20s in set numbers. If I did a program that programmed 15 to 20 sets for everything, I would burn my hamstrings right off the bone, and my side delts would just never really go anywhere. That, I think, is the beauty of volume landmarks, is kind of knowing at least where to shoot the shotgun, right? And where the individual shells or the individual little holes are poked in the sheet of paper, then you can kind of adjust it based on every week of training. You can go up, you can go down, etc. But at least knowing kind of where to start and where to finish, because I think a lot of sort of pre-prescribed programs that were written earlier on, they suffer from the limitation of not being individually adjusted to volume. For example, let's take a program like 531. It's a fundamentally very good program in the way it's structured. 531 came at a time when powerlifting was recovering from its equipment binge, and 531 was like, here's this basic-ass raw program. Run the shit, you'll get strong, it's sweet. The thing is, 531 is the identical volume for everyone, short of any kind of advanced modifications you want to make for it. For some people, that was like the right amount of volume. For some people, very few, it was way too much. And for most people, it just wasn't enough. So I really don't like programs that say you do this many sets of this and this many sets of that. I think most good programs should be like, start around here, see how your body responds, and adjust to where you need to be.
Right. Yeah. On the topic of, say, like 531, I feel like that's like a very low rep, high weight program. I think we should do intensity and reps, kind of like a fair analysis here. So for hypertrophy purposes, let's say, do you think we should be counting, heavy doubles or triples the same in terms of volume as, high rep sets of 30 reps or what have you? Because it's like at those outlier ranges where things start to kind of like look a little tricky with tracking sets. Or do you think there's like some kind of middle range where you should just be pretty much all the time if you're a bodybuilder?
Yeah. So part one is that no, you don't count them the same. So anything south of 5 reps is going to be vastly disproportional in its fatiguing effects and underwhelming in its hypertrophic effects. Well, it's great for strength, but it's just not very good for hypertrophy because the fatigue is way, way higher. Imagine you had to do 20 total reps in a program, but they all had to be 95% max singles in the squat. It's 20 singles. You're going to die before you get to anywhere. And 20 reps, my God, you could do sets of 10 and get 40 reps, 4 sets of 10. I mean, that's a pretty decent workout. It's nothing to write home about. And that's more hypertrophy benefit. It has been clearly demonstrated by numerous studies, but it's some kind of small fraction of the fatigue. On the other end, there's another problem with super, super high rep sets of 50, 60, 70 reps, things like that. Most of the reps being done are simply to get you tired enough for the muscles to start struggling enough to actually present even a relative overload, okay, to accumulate any kind of lactate, to get the fast twitch motor units firing because the slow twitch ones have lost some power. That, maybe the last 5 reps, the last 10 reps are challenging, but the first 50 or 60 are just paths to get there. So again, I think there's actually a disproportionate level of fatigue to hypertrophic effect with those super high reps because you're accumulating a shitload of volume for no damn reason, just to get yourself prepared for that. So as far as efficiency goes, it's not a great way to train unless you're really hurt. So I think that constrains the hypertrophy benefit range between about 5 reps to about 30. And for most cases, even just about 20. So anytime I see a hypertrophy program training within 5 to 20 rep sets, I don't really ask any questions about reps very much. I'm just go, oh, cool, okay, great. If someone's got a hypertrophy program and they put it on my desk and they say, hey, what do you think about this? And there's anything south of 5 reps or north of 30 especially, even north of 20, I start to be like, so why is this in here? And if there's a good reason, that's great. But sometimes there's not a good reason. And for the mentioned reasons, I think it's at least very poor efficiency on the high rep side, and just very poor fatigue management for the amount of jackness you get on the low rep side.
Right. I guess one other thing we should probably address is intensity, or we can just call it effort, because some people who I find are really volume tracking junkies will just become obsessed with hitting a certain volume threshold and not really be exerting themselves hard enough to get much out of it, in my opinion. So is there a way that you gauge that in terms of like how hard you need to be working in terms of an intensity threshold in order for this to even count?
Yeah, totally. So the term for that is the relative intensity, and that's just how far have you gone, not on how many total reps you've done or how much weight there is, but relative to what you can do as a maximum. And I think the best measurement for that is for bodybuilding training or for hypertrophy training is repetitions in reserve. I think when you get to like doing low reps, because the reps in reserve are like 1 or less for everything. Sometimes the RPE method is better, where you do 9.5 or 8.5 or something like that. But reps in reserve is a great method. It's just whatever number it is, that's how many reps you could have done if there was a gun to your head and you had to go to failure. So I think anything, which is an unfortunate way to train. I've heard stories about like various Eastern Bloc coaches having like a loaded pistol on the gym floor to scare lifters. Man, wouldn't surprise. It's highly unfortunate. So anything shy of 5 reps in reserve is going to have hypertrophic effects. They're just going to be vastly lower than anything north of 5 reps. So I think that for training between 4 to 5 reps in reserve all the way to failure, you're in the most productive hypertrophy range. But if you're really just cutting your reps or sets super short of failure, you're probably missing out on some kind of relative effect, at the very least for efficiency gains. So like you just have to do that much more volume to get the same effect. So sometimes when people say, I can do 40 reps for my side delts and not overreach, I'm like, where are you stopping those sets? And they're like, I just get like sets of 5 and I could do like 19 more, but I don't. The thing is that actually is very rare because most of the same kinds of people that want their MRVs to be artificially inflated also take every set to concentric failure and beyond. So, so it's rare. Every now and again with sort of meeker trainees, you send send me a video of your last set from last week, and they send you a video and you're like, my God, you have like 50 reps left. And like, I don't know, it's still pretty hard. And you're like, okay, I can see why we've been programming this much volume. So I think that bears mention.
Gotcha. Probably like just as a rough ballpark, you're tracking sets that are somewhere in the, let's say 5 to 20 rep range. And then that leave no more than say 4 or 5 reps in the tank.
Correct.
Something like that.
Now we're talking.
Yeah. I'm curious what your thoughts would be. There's this camp of people, I feel like they're a little bit more on the periphery in the scientific community, but they'd argue that volume isn't really all it's made up to be. What's more important is taking sets to momentary muscular failure. And provided you're taking sets to muscular failure, you don't need to accumulate a whole lot of volume because you can max out the hypertrophic response. So there's a few researchers, in particular Fisher and Steele, who've kind of made this argument again and again, and they've kind of written some, I guess, rebuttals to Schoenfeld's work on this. What do you think of that, or do you think we really do have a knockdown smoking gun case that volume is the main driver here?
So they have one small point, and the point is this: as you get closer to failure, the magnitude of hypertrophic response increases, so that a set of 12 reps taken to momentary muscular failure, let's say with a weight that takes it to momentary muscular failure, versus a set of 12 reps with a slightly lower weight that leaves 2 reps in the tank, that set of 12 that goes to muscular failure will, per unit of volume, have more hypertrophic effect. It will grow more muscle. The problem is that the fatigue accumulation from momentary muscular failure, or the closer you get to failure, is actually exponential. So if you go to failure, you're getting way more fatigue than if you go just 2 reps shy of failure. And 2 reps shy of failure, you still get quite a high degree of hypertrophy. I actually think I would be willing to put much of my scientific reputation on this claim that around 2 reps in reserve is the average, not always best, average best place to stop a set for hypertrophy, because it gives you the best trade-off of hypertrophic effect to not crazy fatigue.
Yeah.
If you always go for RIR, you get very low fatigue, but you get not so much of a benefit. So I think the trade-off is meh. But if you go, all the way to failure, your fatigue is crazy. Even though your hypertrophy is linearly increased, your fatigue is exponentially increased. Why is that relevant? Well, if it's the last microcycle before you deload, it's not, which I think is why you can definitely go to failure and probably should go close on a last microcycle before a planned deload. But on any other microcycle, remember there's 2 components to every single time you go in the gym, and it's not a final microcycle. It is, how do I do the best job to grow today, and how is that going to set me up to do the best job to grow next week? So that last part is just completely obviated. It's just not answered by people who advocate failure training. If you are anywhere other than a beginner, I'm sure you've tried this yourself. I actually used to train. I used to be one of these folks. I used to train on a multiple set, all sets to failure program. That's how I discovered fatigue accumulation. Because every 3rd week, my body would fall apart into pieces. I just wouldn't be able to match any of my reps, which is actually how we define MRV. You can no longer match sets and reps at the predicted intensity that you're supposed to. So I would crash into my MRV all the time and just wonder why I couldn't survive an old program. It's because fatigue accumulated, boom, like this. It's not a productive way to train sustainably. I think that's the kind of final word on that sort of training. It does work, but if you want to put volume is very well correlated to how much gain you're getting. It's more correlated than relative intensity. So it's more important to find a way to keep the relative intensity good, 2 sets or 2 reps or so short of failure, but to really pump as much volume as you can into that. And every single review of the literature that has been done that's been any good shows that volume is actually more important than relative intensity, and shows that, yeah, if you train close to failure, there are ways to make it work okay. But because of this fatigue accumulation problem, submaximal higher volume programs simply cause more hypertrophy. Funny enough, if you look at the way most bodybuilders train, even the ones on a million different steroids, almost no one takes every set to concentric muscular failure. Most bodybuilders keep some reps in the tank to do more and more sets. That's how people get the biggest. People always say, well, what about Dorian Yates? What about this and that guy? They're choosing and picking 1 out of 100 examples, where the other 99 guys, if you told them, hey, why don't you go to failure? They'd be like, I tried that before. I just broke in half.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the real world results are pretty unquestionable. One thing they might argue is that for people who maybe aren't trying to be like the best bodybuilders in the world or what have you, it may be a more time efficient way to train. So if you don't have the time to say do all this volume, then taking 1 single set to momentary muscular failure might be a way to sort of make the most of the time that you do have in the gym. And then maybe, if you need it, take more time in between sessions to allow for that recovery.
Maybe I got a rebuttal to that. I think it's a fine way of doing things, and it's definitely on the right logical track. what I would say is, if you're really interested, if you're going to play the efficiency game over the sort of optimality game, then what you're really going to end up going towards is still saving about 2 reps in the tank to reduce acute fatigue. Because if you go all the way to failure on a set, you don't just do a set right after. You're broken. You're like, and you're psychologically like, it's tough to just gather yourself to do anything. Stopping, if you want maximum efficiency, you stop each set 2 reps or so on average from failure, and you grab another barbell or another dumbbell or another machine, and you do the antagonistic body parts for another set right after, and then you grab a couple of seconds to breathe, and then you repeat that first exercise. Antagonistic compound supersets, bench supersetted to pull-ups, shoulder press superset to upright row, bicep curl supersetted to tricep extension, squats supersetted to hamstring stuff. That's the kind of, with very little rest between sets, that's really, you can't beat that as far as efficiency. I can burn someone to a crisp in 30 minutes with a workout like that. Twice a week, that's a great general fitness workout. If you're really intent on going to failure, first of all, it's psychologically very difficult. And because of that recovery time you still need between sets, I just think we're sort of deifying this momentary muscular failure point, and purposelessly. And I know I've gotten into, boy, oh boy, I used to have a history of getting into debates with high-intensity training advocates. I'm actually so philosophically a very big fan of the school of objectivism, Ayn Rand, capitalism, all that stuff. And a lot of those folks tend to gravitate for some fucking reason or another to high-intensity training. And I used to debate them all the time because I thought they could do better. And one of the things they were saying is, 1 set to failure is the only non-arbitrary way to train. And I'm like, that is exactly as arbitrary as any, as exactly arbitrary as 2 sets. It's as arbitrary as 2 reps from failure. If you're just picking something randomly, be like, that's what's important. So,
right. When it comes to failure, is there any place for it? If I were to play devil's advocate, even though I'd agree with you, I would say that it does, depend on the exercise. So if you're taking a set of leg extensions to failure, it's not going to do as much as taking a set of squats to failure, not nearly as much. So if you are training to failure, maybe, preferentially allocate that towards exercises that are of lower impact. But what do you think about it? Is there really any place for it, or is it a kind of waste of that fatigue?
So I have an interesting retort. I've heard that argument before.
Okay.
It's a very, very good argument. I have an interesting retort to that. If you can do it on the lower fatiguing exercises, maybe it's not as bad. Jeff, I didn't think we were going into the gym in our quest for the optimal training method to get as jacked as possible. I didn't think we were going into the gym to try to get away with as much shit as possible. I thought we were going to the gym to try to do as good of a job as possible. It's almost like, ideally a toddler would stop hitting everything he saw, but I guess if we give him something padded to hit, it's not as bad. Well, ideally you teach him manners not to hit things in public, and then that's the best. So I don't think we should be asking the question of, well, if we were going to train to failure, maybe leg extensions is okay. Well, given that we have the leg extensions as a program exercise, what's the optimal way to do that? Well, it's still stay shy away from failure and just do more leg extensions, because you get more volume, more hypertrophic stimulus for that ratio of fatigue. But there is a place. So that argument, I think, falls a little bit short, because we shouldn't be asking, can we get away with failure? We should be asking, when is failure the best use of our time and effort? I think the best time for failure, and I think the time when failure is almost needed, is via the progressive overload. What we have is at the beginning of a mesocycle, we'll start at about 4 reps shy of failure, because that's the lowest we can do. That's our minimum effective relative intensity, so to speak, right? And because we're putting more weight on the bar and we don't want our volume to fall, we don't want our reps to fall, we're basically automatically going to be climbing up in RIR. We're going to, next week might be 3 reps in reserve, the week after that 2, etc. We will inevitably climb to failure or very close in the final weeks of our mesocycle accumulation phase. And then we have a deload after. Because the deload reduces so much fatigue, it's a whole week of easy training, we might as well go all the way to failure to get that little extra bit of growth, that superlative stimulus, so that when we have the fatigue reduction powers that we need with a deload, now training to failure makes perfect sense. Because we have sort of a 2-factor problem. One, we have to do something real special in that last week to provide an overload for the week before, because it was 1 shy of failure the week before. And 2, we have plenty of time and a lot of power to reduce fatigue, so we're not so concerned about accumulated fatigue, because we don't have to come back that next week and try to hit it again. Does that make sense? Yeah. So those 2 things in conjunction mean that at the end of every mesocycle, most mesocycles, we can go very close to failure, and in some programs, going to actual failure is a good idea. That's when the equipment considerations come in handy. You're not going to go to failure on squats unless you got a death wish. Bench presses, maybe, if you got a really trustworthy spotter or a couple. Leg extensions, tricep pushdowns, bicep curls, failure away, but I would say only on the last week. If you're doing failure training anything other than the last week, you're just screwing yourself over for the next week.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the recommendation that you say you're doing 3 sets or 4 sets per exercise? For the first 2 or 3, you'll leave 2 or 3 reps in the tank, but then for the last set, you take that one to failure because you don't really have, I should say, the last set of the last exercise. Take that one to failure. Do you think that's probably pretty safe?
I think it's pretty safe, but I don't think it's best because you got the next. So you train back twice a week. You got the next back workout to worry about,
right.
Or even if you train once a week, you got the next week to worry about.
Right.
So again, I think we're coming back to like, I'm a coach. I really want to go to failure. How can I get away with it best? If you want the answer of how do I get away with it best, that's completely correct. That would be a good way to get away with the most. But how about we get away from this getting away with failure the most and just trying to program optimally and saying that we're just going to say failure for one time? It's almost like a client asking you, okay, how can I eat the most pizza a week after my bodybuilding show and still not get fat? And you start moving macros around because you're going to have nothing other than pizza and protein shakes. And all of a sudden you're like, well, how about we ask the question of how do I get, the best for my next bodybuilding show and put on the most lean mass possible? And they're like, okay. And you're like, okay, we're going to have pizza once a week. And then the rest of the time we're going to follow a good diet. And, that's I think where we're trying to go with that.
Yeah, I gotcha. I think if I'm going to push this one last time, I promise this
Please.
is the end. One case that could be made for it is the fact that people are, especially beginners and maybe early intermediates, are pretty bad at knowing how many reps they have left in the tank. And so unless they felt what that failure feels like, unless they actually do it, they don't really know how hard they're pushing themselves. So I think that maybe what you're saying should apply to more people towards the more advanced end of the spectrum, and people who maybe are new and don't know what that feels like should be, taking a few sets to failure so that they are pushing themselves a little bit harder and they really know, in fact, how close they are to that threshold. So they're not actually stopping, like you said in your example of your client, they're not actually stopping 10 reps shy of failure and saying, I need all this volume to make progress, where in fact, they just need to ramp it up a bit. So you need to flirt with that sometimes. You need to actually, in fact, take it there in order to know what that feels like.
Flirting leads to indiscretion, sir. I'll have to remind you of that. So you're coveting failure is what you're saying. Man, boy, do I have a good answer for this one. So part 1, the idea that it is a very big problem that beginners do not get close enough to failure is already statistically wrong, because I can spot you a beginner anytime you want at the gym, find a not jacked guy who's like bleeding under a barbell somewhere because he went 5 reps past failure and he's like, help. But he's not saying help because he's like, I can still get out. You're like, okay, guy, right? It's like I've been spotting guys on the bench and they're like, don't take it. And I'm like, no, I'm taking it. I don't want the ambulance to show up. They're like, I'm doing you a favor. You'll come thank me later. So first of all, most beginners, their problem is that they go too close to failure because they view training as a catharsis. And they think there's a one-to-one relationship between relative intensity and gains. Usually one too many Rich Piana memes, and all of a sudden you're like, do what it takes, everything, you have to do everything you can. And they're like, yeah, clearly, we're talking about young males here, you know what I mean? Like, they're going to go to failure. First of all. Second of all, this was something we covered extensively in the book Dr. James Hoffman and I wrote about training volume. It's called How Much Should I Train? Actually, it's the name of the book. We actually don't believe that beginners should approach MRV, nor do we believe that beginners should approach failure very closely. Here's why. There's a couple of reasons. Number 1 is the more beginners approach failure because they have an unstable, poorly developed technique, the more likely it is that their technique is going to falter and they're going to start learning bad technique. You got a beginner doing squats. Their squats look great up until they hit about 2 or 3 reps in reserve. And then their back starts to round, their shoulders cave forward, and they start looks like they're being born again. Like literally someone's giving birth to them. You know what I'm talking about. Where you're like, damn, you see someone's rep and you're like, that shit was a religious experience. How do you feel? And they're like, get the holy water, that's not exactly some technique you want to practice. The bad thing is that if beginners practice a certain way, it's really hard to get rid of poorly learned techniques. And I'm sure you've come across this in your own coaching practices. You're like, show me a squat, and they do a squat, and you're like, all right, well, you don't know how to squat. We're just going to teach you all over again. And that's really tough. But there's a worse problem. Executing such poor technique reps, especially if you get into the habit of it, pushing close to failure, not only is the act of pushing close to failure, but pushing close to failure with poor technique, it leads to a higher chance of both wear and tear injuries and acute injuries, precisely for the people that are going to pay the most when they get hurt, which is beginners. So in order to keep people not hurt and keep them from learning poor technique, we don't think that it's a good idea to get very close to failure for beginners. But here's the quintessential thing that makes this possible. Beginners don't have a problem with gains. You get your noob gains, so why don't you go from minimum effective volume all the way up to maybe 2/3 of the way to your MRV and just recycle and go back down and start building up again, focus on getting strong for reps. And when it comes to failure, go anywhere from 4 to 6 reps in reserve to 2 reps in reserve. If you have a good coach around, he'll cut you off at that point and then cycle back down. As a beginner, you're making such amazing gains. Once you are intermediate and more advanced, when there is a need to get closer to failure to tap into more advanced adaptations, learning how to go to failure is pretty fucking easy at that point, and you've already flirted with it. It's going to be pretty obvious. But I think that this idea that we need to teach beginners and intermediates how to get close to failure because they're not training hard enough. I don't think they should be training that hard because gains are not a problem at that point. Mm-hmm. And any level of gains, any level of stimulus you're not getting can be overcome by just adding more sets to the program, which actually gives them more technical practice in the lifts, which makes them technically more sound at submaximal weights, which is how you end up developing really good lifters for later on.
Right. I don't know if there could be a bit of a selection bias in terms of the people who are coming to you maybe have like more of a history of an athletic background, or maybe even though they might be more new, they're maybe more audacious with their goals than people who maybe are just like regular gym goers. So there was this study, I don't know if you've seen it, but I think there was like 400 subjects. They asked them how many reps they think they could, or how many reps they typically do if they went to the gym with a set weight. It was something around like, what would be your 10 rep weight that you'd normally do when you go to the gym? And something like, I think 13% of people got more than 10 reps or more than 20 reps with their typical 10 rep weight. So they were leaving something like 10 reps in the tank. And the average, I think, was something like 6 or 8 reps left in the tank in that study. So I think that what that highlights is that a lot of people aren't actually training hard enough. For every person, like you described, the Rich Piana guy who is going in there and training all out, I feel like there's also a person who's going in there just going through their motions. They're on the phone half the time, and they're just not really getting anywhere near that intensity threshold that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So an interesting thought about that study is, first of all, if you actually let those people train at what they thought was failure, which was really 6 to 8, I don't think you'd see a problem with long-term hypertrophy in those individuals for a very long time. Because interestingly enough, in the first several weeks, sometimes several months of training, beginners see very little progress altogether in hypertrophy. Primarily neural adaptations account for most of the strength increase. One of the reasons is I think we're essentially outdoing MRV right from the get-go. I mean, people who should train 1 set per week, we're giving them 3x10 programs right away. So I think it's actually a good thing when beginners underdose their training, because they should have low-dose training to begin with. Second of all, the way we test repetition maxes in training, or in the laboratory, if you've ever been in this kind of environment, it is multiple researchers stand around, including graduate assistants, often of the opposite or same sex, whatever your proclivities may be, and they are yelling at you, and they are encouraging you, and they're yelling really loudly, and they warm you up, and you understand your purpose is to show off and be the hero and do as many reps as you can, no matter what. That kind of failure is so fucking unsustainable in a program. That is the equivalent of a meet. That is a strongman meet you just did. So when people say, well, they really should be training like that all the time, no, they fucking shouldn't. Yeah. That's 5 reps more than they should normally be doing. Failure in training means failure under normal circumstances. That already gives you a shitload of fatigue. That effort that they did when they got 20 more reps or whatever than they thought, or 13 more reps than they thought, that is not a sustainable effort. It's good that they think they fail 6 to 8 reps shy of that, because that's where their most productive training is going to be. Training like you do in a laboratory as a show-off experiment is not training. That is, I guarantee you, those people were sore for a week and a half from that shit, from probably one set. And that is not a sustainable way of training. So I think counterbalancing those two things, and because beginners just don't need much to grow, I think, yeah, Jeff, there is a point there where, if, especially in a client trainer interaction, if you see someone, sometimes females are more statistically likely to have this kind of issue where they're just a little bit, they go afraid of the weights, a little bit afraid of their sort of feeling their own swag a little too much. And, you look at them and you're like, clearly you're not pushing it. I think there is a time and place, even for beginners, especially intermediates, to be like, let's push the pace a little bit more. But I think that group of people is actually in the minority, and most people are if they're into that 6 to 8 reps away from their actual laboratory failure point, I think that's a pretty good way for them to train. And that's, I think, where most productive training occurs, with the least downsides of injury or pushing it too hard. I think once you get to intermediates and especially advanced, if you continue to have that problem, yeah, you need a wake-up call. You need to try harder. But I think, even in the non-Rich Piana crowd, just doing a few more sets of getting good technical practice beats trying to approach this mythical failure point more.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I think that where the rubber hits the road, we actually do agree on this point. I just feel like in my more like recent developments, I guess I've reached more out to the general public, and I see people worrying about these, like, what I would consider to be slightly more advanced concepts, where they don't even have that, I would even say, psychological framework where they're willing to even like exert themselves a little bit harder, especially in the case of people who don't maybe have quite any kind of athletic background, so they're really not used to exerting themselves physically even. So that is why I would emphasize that. But for all that, I still wouldn't say it's necessary to actually take a lot of sets to failure. That would really never be the recommendation, especially for a beginner. But just to, I guess, get comfortable with going past that point of complete comfort, if that is logically coherent.
For sure. Yeah. I think you called it earlier. Most of my advice revolves around people who are trying to, I'm known as like the hypertrophy optimizer guy, right? Yeah. Like, if you want like to really be a robot, and go see Dr. Mike. But like, most of those people don't have effort problems. They have the opposite problem, where they would just gladly do 5 times the amount of work, relative and absolute, that they would need. But I think for the people who are a little bit meeker, I think kind of a pulling them in slowly approach is better than a make sure you're going close to failure. Yeah. It's kind of like, let's see how hard you're working. You watch them for a couple of sessions, and you go, you just keep increasing their weights and tell them, just keep doing the same. My favorite way to approach people to failure gently is to just put more weight on the bar over the weeks and just say you still have to hit 10 reps. And they're like, I don't know, it's getting pretty hard. And I'm like, you're still doing it. Keep going. If you give them that, and that's the easy way to do it. Forget about approaching failure as far as, well, give me all you got. You just never have to say that. You just put 5 more kilos on the bar every week, and you said, sets of 10, sets of 10, sets of 10. Sooner or later, they get 9. And clearly that was because they went to failure. So you'll get them there eventually. I think that's a pretty solved problem.
Yeah, it's interesting how the roles have switched a little bit here, because you're typically known as the guy who's telling people to do as much as you can to max out your results. And now you're kind of arguing for, you don't need to do as much as you can.
It's, you know what, man, it's all population specific. When I begin with beginners, it's super gentle, super easy, just loving training, fundamental motor patterns. And then we grow these people over the years into psychotic death machines that only want destruction and pain.
Exactly. It's a beautiful thing.
That's right.
You've talked a lot about a mesocycle. I would imagine a number of people will be familiar with that term, but maybe we can talk about some specific programming stuff. So you've laid out, I think, your 4 main key concepts here. So you have the maintenance volume, which, as you said, is to maintain, you need to do like a lot less than you need to actually gain, maybe like half, a third, something like that, of what you'd need to gain?
Yeah, so like I think maintenance volume is about half of the average between MEV and MRV. Okay. So the average amount of volume you do is probably about half. So like a lot of people will be able to maintain all of their muscle and strength with 6 to 8 working sets per week per body part, whereas most people grow best from something like 15. So basically about half, which is, a significant finding. It's not your minimum effective volume. It's much lower than that, which is really cool implication.
Gotcha. And then you do have your minimum effective volume, which is kind of like that lowest volume you need to make any progress at all.
Totally.
Yeah.
For the average intermediate, a super average number to kind of start thinking about this stuff. There's tons of variation for individuals and all that stuff. But the average intermediate, something like 10 sets per week per body part is a minimum effective volume for a lot of people in that range, 8 to 12.
It sounds low. I feel like a lot of people on the internet really are these crazy high volume junkies, and you're known in our science-based field as a high volume guy. And 10 sets
Apparently.
a week is actually sounds kind of almost trivially low. I mean, it's just 4 sets one day, 4 sets another day, you're done. Pretty low. But those are tough sets, kind of as we've outlined them. So that there is that caveat.
Those are working sets for sure. Mm-hmm.
And then you've got your maximum adaptive volume, which maybe you could describe that one a little bit better. I know you said it was kind of like a nebulous thing between an EV and MRV, but how do you think about that?
So maximum adaptive volume is just something that we have to theoretically define because it's theoretically very important, although practically it's very difficult to get a hold of. It's the volume at any one time that if we had to do one session, it would get you the most gains possible. The thing is that your maximum adaptive volume floats. When you start a new program, new exercises, sets, and reps, if you do too much of that, then you just spend so many resources recovering that you spend fewer adapting. So when you start a program, your maximum adaptive volume is actually really close to your minimum effective volume. As you train, provide overload more and more, the definition of overload is as soon as you've done something, it's going to take more to get that same result. So you have to do more, more reps, more sets, more weight, whatever. Your maximum adaptive volume through the course of the mesocycle will increase, and it'll end up just at or just below or just over your maximum recoverable volume eventually. So it kind of floats from your minimum effective to your maximum recoverable. Luckily, that's how we train as we go from minimum effective to maximum recoverable. So hypothetically, in a very good program, you're real close to your maximum adaptive volume at all times. People ask me like, well, why not just start at your maximum adaptive volume right away? Well, first of all, you'd start at some value much higher than it. If you think if it's, so let's say it's between 10 and 20. If you start at 15, that's already way more than you're kind of ready for. You should have started closer to 10. But even if, let's say it was 15, the overload principle says that as soon as you do that volume, the next week you're going to need more. It's by definition a moving target. It's kind of saying like, what's the optimal amount of Spanish language practice to do to keep getting the best possible at Spanish? Well, 5 minutes of Spanish a week will make you better for a couple of weeks. After that, it's going to be 10, and sooner or later it's going to be you have to live in Spain. So you can't just be like, we'll just do this number all the time. Like your body adapts, right? So the maximum adaptive volume, just something to keep us grounded to the idea that, we are looking for this optimal value. Because one early retort to MRV is like, who cares about what you can recover from? What's going to work the best? Well, those are pretty closely tied, right? And then MRV on the other end is the most volume you can recover from, recovery defined as can you repeat the same performance. So basically, if you bench 225 for sets of 10, like hard sets of 10, and all of a sudden, you do like say 20 sets of chest, and next week you're benching sort of 225 again, but it's sets of like 8, 6, 4, 4, 3. You haven't recovered your performance from last week. You're not performing as typically expected. That means something happened. And if you continue to approach, let's say 20 sets is your MRV, if you continue to approach your MRV and you basically, you'll say your MRV is 20, if every time you get to at or pass around 20 sets for chest, let's say, and your performance starts to drop off, that is basically around your maximum recoverable volume, the most you can recover from. Training above that chronically is simply not productive for multiple reasons. One, it's injurious. Two, it biochemically overreaches you, which means your muscles are now basically trying to recover and survive. They're not really trying to adapt anymore. And the worst, probably one of the worst parts, is that you're physically unable to provide an overload at this point. It's like, if your performance is dropping, how the hell do you do more? You have to put more weight on the bar at some point to get stronger so you can get bigger. How the hell do you do that if you literally can't lift the same amount of weight for the same reps you do? Right. So training over your MRV is pretty stupid. On average, I have found through a variety of channels, and now finally formal research is catching up with a lot of Schoenfeld studies and other stuff, that something around 20 sets is at least where most people, their average musculature experiences maximum recoverable volume or close. So what I would say is 20 sets is not a magic number, because there are no magic numbers. But like, if you're consistently doing more than 20 sets per body part per week and your progress sucks and you feel like your recovery is burdened, you got to think about probably doing less. Whereas like if you're doing 8 sets per week and you think like, this isn't working, you're probably not doing too much.
Right. I gotcha. So before we wrap it up here, Mike, and I think in part 2, we'll get into some more of the like complex topics, periodization, maybe frequency, some stuff like that, and then maybe specific programming examples, especially as it would apply to like a power builder or someone who wants to combine strength and power. But first, just so we kind of have the rest of the foundation laid, can you explain what a mesocycle is, and then how you've kind of alluded to it throughout, but just quickly in summary, how you would apply the concept of, say, a minimum effective volume and maximum recover volume within a mesocycle, and then how that might apply across, say, a macrocycle or a full training year or what have you?
Sure. So, mesocycle is basically like, it's a unit of microcycles that are similarly structured, put together in sequence. And a mesocycle generally has two parts: the accumulation phase, which is the application of overload, starting from something that minimally gets you results all the way up to, jumping up and up the ladder of overload, moving more and more and more until you get to the most you can recover from. And then the second part of the mesocycle, or of most mesocycles, is the deload, where as fatigue accumulates, and it generally does so over the course of multiple weeks, anywhere between 3 and 8 weeks, mesocycle length, we basically see fatigue accumulating. After fatigue gets to a certain point, it becomes counterproductive to continue to train. So then we deload, reduce the fatigue, and then we start another mesocycle, which is another foray into the stratosphere. It's kind of like a mesocycle can be seen as climbing a mountain, right? You start at base camp, you go out to summit, and then you come back down, you rest and recover, and then you climb another mountain, right? Because mountains are discrete entities, it's very, you don't plan a trip being like, okay, Tuesday, we're going to climb this mountain, and then by the next Tuesday, we're going to climb halfway up this other mountain. Someone's like, okay, but what about the other half? You're like, well, we just plan it in like 1 week increments. Who cares about the other way? Like, that's nonsense, right? So it's discrete entities based on the application of overload and the accumulation of fatigue. When we can't apply overload anymore, and when our fatigue is maxed out, then we have to deload, and that gives us a finite place to cut things off. So every mesocycle is kind of like a multi-week long wave. And oftentimes, because of the principle of specificity, every microcycle looks very similar. It's just more stuff, whether it's more weight, more reps, more sets, some combination of all those. The repetitions in reserve usually falls. So you'd have very similar exercises week to week to week. You just do more and more and more and more. And then you get too much fatigue, deload, repeat. That's basically a mesocycle. Usually, you start with your minimum effective volume, and because why the hell would you start anywhere else? And then you work your way up in volume, just not because you're targeting your MRV. You're not like, we're going to go towards MRV. You're simply applying overload. And by doing so, you get closer to MRV. And once you get to your MRV, it's not like the magical point that when you reach it, you're like, ha, we got it, goal. It's not a goal. It's just going further than that is counterproductive. And fatigue is super high at that point, so you have to deload, and then you start at minimum effective volume again. And for whatever body parts or methods of training that you don't want to decline during that time, but you want them to maintain, you keep those at maintenance volume. So for example, if you're really blasting your chest, your back, and your legs, you take them through a mesocycle from MEV all the way to MRV, deload, repeat. And for maybe your other body parts, your biceps, triceps, whatever that you have on the back burner, you might keep those at maintenance volume the entire time so they don't shrink on you, but so they stay the same size. Maybe you do a couple of mesocycles in a row of blasting, chest, shoulders, and or chest, back, and legs, or whatever the hell I said, whatever's on the front burner. You do that for 2 to 4 mesocycles, and then you build up some what I call adaptive resistance. Body parts don't like to grow for a really long time; they need breaks every now and again. You switch those around. You take the ones you had on maintenance volume, and then you prioritize those for a while, and that's kind of how maybe you would construct a macrocycle.
Gotcha. Makes a lot of sense.
Which is wrong. It's got to be wrong, right?
Yeah. One way I think about these in terms of like time scale is like the microcycle is basically usually just a week.
Yep.
Mesocycle is a month or 2, maybe 3. And then a macrocycle is on the scale of like 6 months to a year or something like that. You think that's about right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly correct. Yeah. And the mesocycle, what really I think determines a mesocycle length, unless you try to get fancy and again make this mistake of trying to work towards some magical time instead of letting the training principles play out and determine the time, kind of like trying to reach for MRV as opposed to just accumulating overload to get there. Unless you're playing weird tricks, I think repetitions in reserve and relative intensity is really what determines mesocycle length. Because, anything lower than 5 reps in reserve is probably too easy. We can't sustainably train to failure every week. So we have this range, right? And we start one of our weeks at the low end, and then as we accumulate overloads, we tend to see that their RIR starts to shrink. Whenever it shrinks, we're done, and it's time to deload. If you are advanced, or sorry, if you are a beginner to intermediate, you don't accumulate fatigue as fast, and you make such rapid adaptations that you can milk out, man, sometimes more than 8 weeks of accumulation. Like, you'll do squats in 1 week. The next week, you'll do even more weight and more reps, but your RIR won't fall because you got that much better at squatting over a week, right? Advanced people just doesn't happen anymore. So as you go from beginner intermediate to advanced, you start to get into a situation where your mesocycles usually shrink in duration, and then you're running sort of like a 1 month accumulation phase. It's funny, I was talking to Jared Feather, one of my colleagues at RP, and is a natural pro bodybuilder, and he's like, you're still running a 4-to-1 accumulation, which means 4 microcycles up, 4 weeks up and 1 down and deload. And I'm like, yeah. He's like, dude, I'm still running 4-to-1 and it's getting tough. He's like, I'm gonna have to switch to 3-to-1 soon. He's been training for 10 years. So at some point, people, I'm sure you find it funny when people are like, yeah, I'm doing a 12-week mesocycle. You're like, how the hell do you survive? What is it that you're doing for 12 weeks that constitutes a mesocycle? And when you look into it, sometimes they have really easy periods, kind of for no reason. Or another problem, like we talked about earlier, they're really far from failure a lot of the time. And you're asking them, like, yeah, you're training, but you're not even providing an overload. And as a super beginner, you could just get jacked no matter what, especially if you're advanced. Unless you're pushing it to some extent, you're just really not going to benefit a whole lot. So mesocycles usually get shorter as you get more advanced.
Yeah, I totally agree. I really like that setup. I feel like, and you may not like this categorization, I'm not sure of your thoughts on this, but I like the fact that it does borrow some parts from the sort of block periodization concept, where you'll focus on maybe one, or you said 3 specific entities in one mesocycle, put the rest at maintenance so you can maintain those and give the attention to the stuff you're really trying to develop that it needs. And then maybe in the next one, you can, switch to a slightly different area of focus, put the other body parts at maintenance that you're not focusing as much attention on, and then continue to build in that way. I feel like that's a pretty good strategy for guys who are more towards the advanced end of the spectrum.
Oh, absolutely. For the advanced, I love the term block periodization. I'm a subscriber to what's called in sports science modern periodization, which takes daily undulating, block, etc., and puts them all together in a sort of finely tuned arrangement. But constructing different mesocycles or putting a couple of them together into blocks and having distinct blocks for distinct adaptation is really good practice. I think that. I actually just wrote this down as a Facebook post I'll be making later. Maybe by the time this goes out, I'll have the post, maybe not. I've been super busy doing a bunch of formal writing, so it's difficult to make posts all the time. But if your goal is maximum muscular potential in the long term, as a beginner, you should emphasize everything, because the summation of every maximum recoverable volume of each body part, your bicep MRV plus your chest MRV plus your legs for all of your body, is still under your total body systemic MRV, your total body's ability to recover from just overall stress. As you get more advanced, that summation actually exits the range of your total body recovery. Like if I told you, Jeff Nippert, if I told you had to take every muscle group and prioritize it, at the same time, you'd be like, okay, I'm just going to do that for 1 week and then die of old age the next week. This is not going to happen, right? That might be double your MRV for your whole body. So what we have to do is, as we get more advanced, at first we prioritize everything. That is, everything goes from MEV to MRV. Later, we'll leave some things at around MEV for the whole mesocycle while pushing everything else MEV to MRV, maybe just a couple of our strong points or something we don't want to work on. As we get more advanced, more of our body parts will be leaving at MEV and taking the rest through MEV and MRV. Later, we'll have to leave some things at maintenance volume to give ourselves much more room. And then as you get more advanced, more things have to be on maintenance to prioritize just 1 or 2 or a couple of things. So like, for example, Branch Warren, I'm sure you know who that is, took 1 year off of leg training. So he even put that below maintenance volume to prioritize his upper body. And then he trained for a couple of months and he got his legs back, because his legs are just genetically freaky legs. So maybe a more advanced version, a more modified version of that would be like just doing 6 sets for every leg muscle for a whole year, maintenance volume, and then just upper body, just crushing it to really bring it up. And I think that's where eventually all advanced training goes.
Gotcha. I feel like on that note, that's a good place to wrap this one up. I feel like people should have a good idea of what you're about and this whole conceptual thing. So next time we can get into more specifics, and
totally.
Awesome. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I just want people to remember, if you just confused what I stand for, it's just hardcore training at all times. Stop thinking and just bleed. If you're not bleeding in the gym, or at least yelling, I'm not sure why you're there.
Yeah, exactly. That's a new way to look at blood flow restriction. You got to flip
now
it.
We're talking.
Yeah.
Blood flow restriction is merely just trying to patch the wounds from the war against the barbells, brother.
Exactly. All right, man. Well, I think I'm going to wrap it up there, and I'll have all your stuff as usual linked down there in the description. So if people want to kind of cross-check it, because I feel like unless you were taking notes or you've heard this before, it might be a little bit tough to like actually pin down the concept. So I'll have all your articles. They're fantastic. Linked down there in the description. You guys can go and check it out, because next time we won't be going in this kind of detail. We're just going to hop right into some more specifics. So you can be on the lookout for that. For everybody listening, in probably about a month, we'll give Mike some time to do some writing and launch some books or whatever you're up to.
Whatever.
Yeah. get your bulk on. Next time you come back, I want to hear you say I'm 275.
Oh boy.
We'll make it happen.
Yahoo. Thank you so much for having me on, by the way.
Sweet, man. All right. Well, yeah, it was a real pleasure. And thank you guys for everybody who's been listening. Don't forget to leave us a like. Thank Mike for taking time out of his busy schedule. Go give him a follow on Instagram. Check out his website. And we'll see you guys all here next time.